The bell above the pawn shop door gave a tired little ring, the kind of sound a thing makes when it has given up on meaning anything, and Elijah Mercer stepped inside with a dog at his heel and 70 years of his life folded into a box the size of his palm. He was 90 years old. His back had curved like a question mark, and his hands shook in a slow, patient rhythm he had long since stopped fighting. He wore an olive field jacket that had once fit a younger, broader man, and the cuffs were frayed to soft white threads. At his side walked Ranger, an old German shepherd and Malinois mix with a gray muzzle and one ear that no longer stood all the way up. The dog moved stiffly, the way old soldiers move, and he kept his shoulder against Elijah's knee as if he were holding the man upright by will alone. "We're closed to dogs," the clerk said without looking up. He was a heavy-set man in his 40s named Dale, and he had the bored, oily patience of someone who bought desperation for a living. "He's a service animal," Elijah said. His voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "He won't touch anything." Dale finally looked up, and his eyes did the math people's eyes always did now. The cheap jacket, the trembling hands, the dog that was clearly too old to be worth anything. He decided, in the space of a breath, that Elijah was nobody. "What ya got?" Elijah set the velvet box on the glass counter and opened it with the care of a man handling something holy. Inside, on a bed of worn fabric, lay the medals. A Navy Cross, a silver star with a small cluster, a row of campaign ribbons gone soft at the edges, and beneath them, wrapped separately in tissue, a purple heart with his name engraved on the back in letters so fine you had to tilt it to the light to read them. Dale picked up the Navy Cross between two fingers like it was a bottle cap. "These real. They're real," Elijah said. "Replicas go for nothing. You'd be surprised how many guys come in here with Grandpa's fake medals." He turned it over, looking for a stamp, a flaw, an excuse. "I can give you $40 for the lot. Scrap and novelty value. $40. Elijah felt the number land somewhere in his chest, in the old place where shrapnel had taught him decades ago that pain could be carried quietly. He looked down at Ranger. The dog was looking up at him, and at the bottom of the box, half hidden behind the campaign ribbons, was the reason any of this was happening at all. A small empty bag of dog food, folded flat, that Elijah had carried in his pocket for 3 days so he would not forget the exact brand the vet had recommended for Ranger's failing kidneys. The dog needed the special food. It cost $38 a bag. Elijah's monthly check had already gone to the rent he was 4 days from missing and the heating oil he had not bought. The Navy Cross alone, Elijah said carefully, is the second highest honor this country gives. A collector would, then go find a collector. Dale slid the box back 2 inches. "40. Take it or walk it." Behind Elijah, the bell rang again. A woman came in with a stroller and stopped short when she saw the old man and the dog, and Elijah felt the heat of being watched, of being a spectacle, of being the sad thing in the room. He had stormed beaches that no longer had names on modern maps. He had carried a wounded man 4 miles through water that wanted them both dead. He had stood at attention while a president shook his hand. And now he stood in a pawn shop, 90 years old, while a man named Dale decided his life was worth $40. Fine, il y a whispered. He could not look at the box as Dale counted out 2 20s from the register, the bills soft and gray. He took them and folded them into his shirt pocket over his heart, where the medals used to be on the one suit he no longer owned. Ranger made a low sound, not a growl, something sadder, a question. "Come on, boy," Elijah said. "Let's get you fed." The woman with the stroller stepped aside to let him pass, and he heard her murmur something to herself, something with the word poor in it, and that was almost worse than Dale. Pity was just contempt that had remembered its manners. Out on the sidewalk, the afternoon had gone gold and long. Cedar Falls was a small town that had once been proud of its veterans and had slowly, the way towns do, forgotten to be. The hardware store had a yellow ribbon faded nearly white in the window. The diner had a sign that said, "Heroes eat free on Veterans Day," and Elijah knew, for a fact, they checked your discharge papers and made you feel like a fraud while they did it. He walked the 4 blocks to Hartley's grocery with Ranger pressed to his side. He bought the bag of special food, $38, leaving him $2 and a single can of soup for himself, which he put back when he saw the total. And the girl at the register, who was maybe 17 and kind in the careless way of the young, said, "You sure? It's just $1." "I'm sure," Elijah said. "I had a big lunch." He had not eaten since the morning before. Outside, he knelt, slowly, with one hand on the cold brick wall, and opened the bag and poured a measure into the collapsible bowl he kept in his jacket. Ranger looked at the food, then looked at Elijah, and did not eat. "Go on," Elijah said. "It's yours. It's all yours." The dog ate then, but slowly, watching the man the whole time, and Elijah understood. Ranger had spent 11 years in the service before he came home to Elijah. 2 deployments, a working dog who had found explosives buried in roads and people buried in rubble, a dog with his own service record and his own scars. Ranger knew the difference between a man eating and a man going without. He always had. That was when the black SUV pulled up to the curb. The man who got out was named Garrett Vance, and everyone in Cedar Falls knew him. He was 55 and silver-templed and tan in the way of men who golf for relationships rather than recreation. He ran the Cedar Falls Veterans Relief Foundation, a charity he had founded 8 years ago, and his face was on a billboard at the edge of town beneath the words they served. Now we serve them. He sponsored the 4th of July parade. He gave a speech every Memorial Day with a catch in his throat that the local paper always described as heartfelt. "Elijah Mercer," Garrett said, smiling, crouching down to Elijah's level in his press slacks. "I almost didn't recognize you. How are you, soldier?" "Sailor," Elijah said. "Navy." Of course. Garrett's smile did not move. "Listen, I heard you've been having a rough patch. You should come by the foundation. We've got programs, we've got resources, heating assistance, emergency funds, the whole 9 yards. A man like you shouldn't be," he glanced at the dog food, "at the $2 Elijah was still holding, shouldn't be out here like this." "I applied," Elijah said. 3 times. The last letter said the emergency fund was depleted for the fiscal year. Something flickered behind Garrett's eyes, quick as a fish under ice. "Bureaucracy," he said smoothly. "These federal grant cycles, they tie our hands. But you let me look into your file personally. I'll make a call." He stood, brushing his knees, and clapped Elijah on the shoulder a little too hard. "We take care of our own in this town." A passing couple slowed to watch the great Garrett Vance bless an old man on the sidewalk, and Elijah saw the woman raise her phone, and he understood, with the cold clarity that had kept him alive in 3 wars, exactly what was happening. He was a photo opportunity. He was a backdrop for somebody else's goodness. Ranger stopped eating. The old dog rose to his feet, hackles lifting along his spine, and fixed Garrett Vance with a stare so flat and ancient that Garrett actually took a step back. "Easy," Elijah said, and put a hand on the dog's collar. "Easy, Ranger." "Quite a guard dog," Garrett said, recovering his smile, but he got back in his SUV faster than he needed to, and as the black glass slid up between them, Ranger kept watching it, until the vehicle had turned the corner and was gone. It was on the long walk home that everything changed. Their route took them down Cedar Street, past the old Veterans Hall, a squat brick building that had been the beating heart of the town's American Legion post for 60 years before it closed. The foundation had taken it over 4 years ago. Garrett's first big project, a planned renovation into a community center for veterans that had never quite happened. Now the windows were boarded with plywood gone soft and gray, and a chain hung across the front doors, and a faded banner promised renovation coming soon beneath the foundation's logo. Elijah had walked past it 1,000 times. So had Ranger. But this time the dog stopped. He stopped so suddenly that the leash went taut, and Elijah nearly stumbled. Ranger had locked up rigid, every old muscle in his body straining toward the building, his nose working the air in hard, fast pulls. A sound came out of him that Elijah had heard exactly twice in 11 years. Once in a market in a country he wasn't supposed to name, and once at an airport when a man with a backpack walked too close. It was Ranger's alert, the sound of a working dog who had found the thing he was trained to find. "Ranger," Elijah said. "Ranger, hail." The dog did not heel. He pulled Elijah toward the side of the building, toward a narrow alley choked with weeds, where a set of concrete steps led down to a basement door. The door was steel, painted over, and it was sealed with a heavy padlock and a chain. Newer than everything else, Elijah noticed, the only thing about the whole derelict building that anyone had bothered to maintain. Ranger went down the steps and put his paw on the door and scratched, and then he sat, and then he looked back up at Elijah, and his whole body said the same thing it had said in that market a decade ago. Here. It's here. The thing is here. There's nothing in there, boy, Elijah said softly. It's just an old building. Come on. You're tired. I'm tired. He pulled the leash. Ranger did not move. The dog who had obeyed every command Elijah ever gave, who had grown so deaf and stiff that he no longer chased squirrels or barked at the mail, planted his 80 pounds on that concrete step and would not be moved. Ranger! Elijah's voice cracked. Please. The dog whined and scratched the door again, harder, and his old claws left pale lines in the paint, and Elijah saw that beneath the new layer there were dozens of older scratches, faint and weathered, as if other animals, or this one, on other days Elijah hadn't noticed, had tried to get into that door before. It was getting dark. It was getting cold. And an old man and his old dog sat on the steps of an abandoned building because neither of them, it turned out, had anywhere better to be. That was where the young man found them. He was maybe 24, in jeans and a Marine Corps sweatshirt, jogging the evening loop around the block, and he slowed when he saw them and then stopped altogether. His name was Marcus Bell. He had come home from his second tour 8 months earlier and had been running every night since, because running was the only thing that turned the noise in his head down to a hum. Sir, Marcus said, you okay down there? We're fine, Elijah said, with the automatic pride of a man who had said it 10,000 times. Dogs just being stubborn. But Marcus had already noticed the way the old shepherd sat. He had served with working dogs. He knew that posture the way you know your own name. Sir, he said slowly, coming down a step, that's a train alert. That dog's not being stubborn. He's telling you something. He crouched and held out the back of his hand, and Ranger sniffed it once and then went right back to staring at the door. Where'd you serve, sir? Navy, Elijah said. A long time ago. What rating? And Elijah, who never told anyone anymore because nobody believed him and the ones who did wanted a show, looked at the young man's tired eyes and saw something there he recognized, and he said quietly, I was a frogman, underwater demolition team, before they called it what they call it now. Marcus went very still. You were a SEAL. They didn't use the word in my day. But yes. So, I was. Marcus looked at the frayed jacket, and the empty velvet impression Elijah didn't know was still visible on his chest where the metals had pinned the fabric flat for years, and the $2 bills crumpled in the old man's fist, and the bag of dog food, and he felt something in his chest go hot and tight. Sir, he said, what's the dog's name? Ranger. At his name, the old dog scratched the steel door again, 3 hard strokes, and barked. A real bark this time, deep and broken and urgent, the first full bark Elijah had heard from him in over a year. Marcus stood up. He pulled out his phone. Sir, I want you to stay right here. I got some guys. We do a thing on Thursdays, a veterans group, mostly Marines, couple of Army, one squid like you, sorry sir, term of endearment. We're 3 blocks away at the diner right now. I think, he looked at the new padlock, the new chain, the only maintained thing on a building everyone had forgotten. I think we ought to find out what your dog's so worked up about. 20 minutes later, there were 7 of them. They came down Cedar Street in the blue dark, young men and one young woman, in hoodies and field jackets, carrying flashlights and a pair of bowl cutters that a man named Reyes kept in his truck for reasons he didn't explain. They were loud at first, joking, the way young veterans are when they don't yet know whether a thing is serious. And then they came down the alley and saw the 90-year-old man sitting on the cold steps with his trembling hands folded around an old dog's collar, and they got quiet. That's him, Marcus said. That's the SEAL I told you about. Mr. Mercer. A big man named Tomas knelt in front of Elijah. Sir, it's an honor. We're going to take care of this. That okay with you? Elijah looked at them, really looked at the 7 young faces in the flashlight glow, at the way they stood, at the careful respect in them that he had not felt directed at himself in 20 years. His eyes stung. He nodded. Reyes set the bolt cutters to the chain. "Hold on," said the young woman, whose name was Danny. "This building belongs to the Veterans Foundation. We cut this lock. We're breaking into Garrett Vance's property. We should call him. Or the police." "Call the police," Elijah said. "Don't call Vance." Something in the way he said it made them all look at him. "Why not Vance?" Marcus asked, and Elijah told them about the 3 applications and the depleted emergency fund and the heating oil he hadn't bought and the metals he'd sold that afternoon for $40, and about the way Ranger had risen up and bared his teeth at Garrett Vance on the sidewalk not 2 hours before. Ranger, who hadn't bared his teeth at a living soul in years. And Danny, who worked days at the county clerk's office and knew how to read public filings, got a strange look on her face and said, "The Foundation's last public 990 listed almost $2 million in program disbursements. For county this size, I always wonder where it all went, because I sure never saw it." Reyes cut the chain. The bolt cutters bit through with a sound like a snapped bone, and the chain slithered down, and Tomas pulled the steel door, and it groaned open on a darkness that smelled of dust and paper and old concrete. Ranger was through it before anyone could stop him, nose down, claws scrabbling, an old dog moving like a young one, and the flashlights followed him down a short flight of interior stairs into the basement. It was full of boxes. Bankers' boxes, dozens of them, stacked floor to ceiling along the walls, and metal filing cabinets, and a desk, and a small fireproof safe. This was not a derelict basement. This was a hidden office. Someone had been keeping it climate-controlled. There was a small, humming dehumidifier in the corner, the only sign of life in the whole dead building, and someone had been keeping it secret. Ranger went straight to a stack of boxes in the far corner and sat and put his paw on the bottom one and looked back, and Marcus, who understood the dog now, went to that box and lifted the lid. It was full of files. Veterans' files. Application after application for relief, for heating assistance, for emergency funds, for medical copays. Hundreds of them. And clipped to the front of each one was a denial letter. The same form letter Elijah had received 3 times, the regretful language about depleted funds and fiscal cycles. And behind each denial, in many of the folders, was something else. A check stub, a disbursement record, showing that the money had been approved, showing that the money had been sent, not to the veteran, to accounts with names like CFE Foundation Operations LLC and Vance Family Holdings and Liberty Outreach Consulting, which Danny would later confirm were all controlled by one man. The veterans had been denied. The money had been moved, and the proof had been buried in a basement beneath a building that Garrett Vance had personally locked, alone, behind the only new chain in town. But that was not all Ranger had found. The old dog left the boxes and crossed to the metal cabinet against the far wall, and he sat in front of the bottom drawer, and he made the sound again, the low, sad, urgent sound from the market a decade ago. Tomas pulled the drawer. Inside, beneath the hanging folders, wrapped in a navy blanket gone stiff with age, was a wooden footlocker, and stenciled on the lid, in faded white letters, was a name. Mircea E. Uditi. Elijah, who had made his slow way down the stairs by then, one hand on Marcus's arm, stopped breathing. "That's mine," he whispered. "That's my footlocker. It was in the hall. They asked for donations for a museum display. Years ago, a veterans' heritage room they were going to build. I gave them," his voice broke, "I gave them everything. My uniform, my letters, my commendation papers, the deed to it. They told me it would be honored. They told me it would be on a wall where children could see it." Marcus lifted the lid. Inside, perfectly preserved, was a life. A pressed dress uniform with the rank Elijah had earned. A folded flag. Letters in a woman's handwriting. Elijah's late wife, Ruth, dead now 11 years. And on top of it all, in a frame Garrett Vance had clearly intended to sell, or had simply forgotten, the official citations for the medals Elijah had sold that afternoon for $40. The Navy Cross. The Silver Star. The story of the day, a 23-year-old frogman named Elijah Mercer had pulled 3 wounded men out of the water under fire and gone back a 4th time for a body so the family would have something to bury. Ranger had not just found stolen money. He had found his master's stolen honor. How the dog knew, Elijah would never fully understand. Maybe the footlocker still carried the scent of the hall, of Ruth, of the man's whole long life, and Ranger had caught a thread of it on the air every time they passed, and had spent months trying to tell an old man who wasn't listening. Maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe the dog just knew that something of Elijah's was locked away in the dark, and a working dog does not rest until the lost thing is found. Danny had already called the sheriff. While they waited, she photographed everything: the boxes, the files, the disbursement records, the account names, and sent the images to 3 places at once so that no matter what happened, the proof could not be buried again. The sheriff arrived, and then a deputy, and then, because Danny had also called the regional newspaper and a veterans legal advocacy group, whose number she happened to know, the basement filled with people and light, and the particular electric quiet of a wrong being uncovered. And at some point in the middle of it all, Garrett Vance came. He came because the alarm on the basement door, the one nobody had known about, had sent an alert to his phone. He came in his press slacks with his easy smile already loading onto his face, the smile that had carried him through 8 years and $2 million and a billboard at the edge of town. He came down the alley saying, "Now what's going on here? This is private property. I'm sure there's a reasonable." And he saw the open footlocker. And he saw the sheriff holding a disbursement record. And he saw the old man sitting on a folding chair someone had brought him, with the dress uniform across his knees and tears on his weathered face. And the smile fell off Garrett Vance like a mask off a wall. Ranger rose and faced him, and this time the old dog did not growl. He simply stood between Garrett and Elijah, ears forward, utterly still, the way he must have stood between his handler and 100 dangers in a country across the world, and he held the man's eyes until Garrett Vance looked away first. "I want a lawyer," Garrett said. "You're going to need one," the sheriff said. They let him out. The neighbors who had gathered at the mouth of the alley parted to let him pass, and they were silent. And that silence said more than any shout could have, because it was the sound of a whole town realizing at once what it had clapped for, what it had put on a billboard, what it had believed. The story broke wide open in the days that followed. The forensic accountants found more than $3 million diverted over 8 years. Relief money meant for some of the poorest, oldest, most forgotten people in the county, money that had been approved on paper and then quietly rerouted into Garrett Vance's accounts while the veterans got form letters about depleted funds. There were car payments in there, a boat, the down payment on a vacation house. And there was the heritage room that was never built, and the footlockers of a dozen old veterans, donated in good faith and stashed in a basement, their medals and uniforms inventory for private sale. Garrett Vance was charged with felony theft, fraud, and elder exploitation. The billboard came down on a Tuesday. Nobody clapped for that either, but a few people cried. And Elijah Mercer got his medals back. It happened on a Saturday, 3 weeks later, in the parking lot of Hartley's Grocery, of all places, because there was nowhere else big enough. Dale, the pawn shop clerk, had surrendered the medals the moment the sheriff explained where they'd come from, and he'd refused to take back the $40, and he'd shown up to the ceremony in his only tie, standing at the back, looking at his shoes. The girl from the grocery register was there. The woman with the stroller was there. Half the town was there. Marcus and his Thursday group had organized the whole thing, and they'd found, somehow, an active-duty color guard from a base 2 hours away, and a bugler, and a Navy captain in dress whites who had read Elijah's record and asked, with his hat in his hand, for the honor of pinning the medals back on. They had pressed Elijah's dress uniform. It still fit, more or less, the way old uniforms do on men who never quite stop being soldiers. But the part that broke everyone, the part that the regional news played over and over and that strangers 1,000 miles away watched on their phones with their hands over their mouths, was Ranger. Marcus had called in one more favor. There's a thing the military does for working dogs who have served, recognition, a small bronze medallion on a ribbon, given for valor in the field. Ranger had earned his years ago, on his second deployment, and it had been lost in the same shuffle of paperwork that loses so many things. Marcus had tracked it down, and when the Navy captain finished pinning the Navy Cross and the Silver Star and the Purple Heart back over Elijah Mercer's heart, where they belonged, he knelt down on the asphalt in his dress whites in front of an old German Shepherd and Malinois mix, and he fastened the ribbon around Ranger's gray neck, and he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Good boy. Good dog. Mission complete. And Ranger, who was deaf in one ear and stiff in every joint and tired in the way that old soldiers are tired, sat up as straight as he could and looked up at Elijah. And Elijah, 90 years old, knelt down, slowly, with Marcus's hand on his elbow, and put his forehead against the old dog's forehead, and the two of them stayed like that while the bugle played, two old soldiers who had carried each other home. The Veterans Hall on Cedar Street reopened the following spring. They rebuilt it with money the court recovered and money the town raised, and they did it with their own hands on the weekends. Marcus and Tomas and Reyes and Danny and dozens of others, young and old, who showed up with hammers and paint. They built the heritage room that Garrett Vance had promised and stolen, and they made Elijah Mercer cut the ribbon. And on the central wall, in a place of honor where children could see it, they hung two things side by side. One was the framed citation for the Navy Cross. The other was a photograph of an old man and an old dog, four heads together, on the asphalt of a grocery store parking lot. Elijah lived 2 more years, and they were good years, the best he'd had since Ruth. The town that had forgotten him remembered, and remembering, took care of him. Not with pity now, but with the fierce, late, apologetic love of people who know exactly how close they came to letting a hero starve on their own clean streets. He never went hungry again. Neither did Ranger. The old dog outlived his master by only 40 days. The vet said it was his kidneys, finally, but Marcus, who sat with Ranger at the end, didn't believe that. He believed what every dog person believes and what no science will ever prove, that Ranger had stayed exactly as long as the mission required, and not 1 day longer, and that when his work was finally, truly done, he had simply gone to find Elijah, the way he always had, by following the one scent in all the world he could never lose. They buried them together in the Veterans Cemetery, with permission that took an act of paperwork and a great deal of love to obtain. 1 stone, 2 names, and beneath the names, the words that the Navy captain had spoken on the asphalt that Saturday, the words that an old dog had been trying to say to a forgetful world for so long, down in the dark, scratching at a locked door that everyone else walked past. Mission complete. So the next time you pass an old man and an old dog on a cold sidewalk, and your eyes do the quick, cruel math that says nobody, that says forgotten, that says not my problem, stop. Look again, because you have no idea what that man carried, or what that dog is still trying to tell you, or how close you might be standing to the bravest heart in your whole town. They were never asking for your pity. They only ever wanted to be seen. If this story moved you, light a candle in the comments for the veterans in your own life, the ones still here and the ones gone ahead. Subscribe to Lena's Tales, because every soul deserves to be remembered, and share this with one person who needs to be reminded that loyalty, real loyalty, never stops working. Not even in the dark. Not even at the very end.